In May of 1905, a fleet of warships steamed into the Tsushima Strait between Korea and Japan, after travelling nearly 18,000 miles from the Baltic Sea. They had been at sea for 7 months. They had crossed the North Sea, rounded Africa, traversed the Indian Ocean, and pushed through Southeast Asian waters, one of the longest naval deployments in modern history. Then, in roughly a day and a half of fighting, the Japanese Navy virtually annihilated them. That contrast is almost difficult to process. Months of preparation, enormous expense, extraordinary logistical effort, thousands of men, dozens of ships, and it was over before the sun set twice. It raises an obvious question almost immediately. Why did Russia do this at all? Why send a fleet that far, under those conditions, against an enemy that had already demonstrated it could fight? The answer isn't simple, and that's exactly what makes this story worth understanding. What happened in 1905 wasn't just a military defeat. It was the collision of imperial ambition with strategic reality, a decision shaped as much by panic and prestige as by genuine calculation. Russia was a great power that had convinced itself great powers didn't lose wars to Asian nations, and when the ground shifted beneath that assumption, the response was to double down rather than reconsider. The Voyage of the Baltic Fleet, formerly the 2nd Pacific Squadron, sits at the intersection of several forces that had been building for years. There was the long-running competition between Russia and Japan for influence over Manchuria and Korea. There was Russia's desperate need for a warm water port in the Pacific to anchor its naval power in the region. And there was the humiliating reality that Japan had struck first, hard, and had been winning ever since. Sending the Baltic Fleet was supposed to change the equation. On paper, reinforcing Russian naval strength in the Pacific with a powerful fleet from Europe could tip the balance. In practice, what Russia sent was a collection of ships of mixed quality, crewed by men of uncertain training, commanded by an admiral who seems to have had few illusions about his chances, sailing into a war that was already going badly and had only gotten worse while his ships were still at sea. There's something almost tragic in the arc of this story, but also something deeply revealing about how empires make decisions under pressure. The voyage wasn't irrational in the sense of having no logic behind it. It was irrational in the way that desperate bets often are. The logic was there, but it rested on assumptions that had already been overtaken by events. Russia needed a victory, and so it reached for one with the only tool available, even when the odds were poor and the evidence was discouraging. What followed was a lesson in modern naval warfare that the world was watching closely. The Battle of Tsushima demonstrated with brutal efficiency what concentrated firepower, superior training and better intelligence could accomplish against a larger force that was exhausted, demoralized and outmatched in nearly every practical dimension. This is the story of how Russia arrived at that moment, the decisions that made the voyage seem necessary, the journey that nearly broke the fleet before it even reached battle, and the single day that rewrote the balance of power in Asia and sent tremors through empires from Tokyo to St. Petersburg. To understand why Russia made that desperate gamble, you have to go back to the late 19th century and the particular shape of imperial competition in East Asia. Because what unfolded between Russia and Japan wasn't a sudden conflict. It was a slow accumulation of rivalry, miscalculation, and mutual suspicion that took roughly a decade to reach its breaking point. By the 1890s, two very different kinds of empire were looking at the same geography and seeing the same opportunity. Russia was a continental giant that had been pushing eastward for centuries, extending its reach across Siberia toward the Pacific, with the relentless logic of expansion that had defined Russian statecraft since the Tsars. Japan was something newer and more startling, a nation that had deliberately modernized itself after the Meiji Restoration of 1868, transforming within a generation from a feudal society into an industrializing state with modern military ambitions and a growing conviction that it deserved a place among the world's great powers. What both empires needed, for different reasons, was influence over the same region. The Korean peninsula and the vast territory of Manchuria, in northeastern China. For Russia, the strategic logic centered on access. The Trans-Siberian Railway was under construction throughout this period, a staggering engineering project meant to connect European Russia to the Pacific coast. But the Pacific terminus at Vladivostok had a serious problem. It froze in winter. Russia needed a warm water port that could operate year-round, and Manchuria offered the possibility of exactly that through Port Arthur on the Liaodong Peninsula. Control of Manchuria also meant the ability to protect and extend the railway, which was quickly becoming the spine of Russian power in the region. Korea, meanwhile, sat at the crossroads. Whoever dominated the peninsula held strategic leverage over the sea lanes that connected all of these interests. For Japan, the picture was almost a mirror image, but with different emotional urgency. Japan's leaders had watched Western powers carve up Asia for decades, and they had spent 30 years modernizing specifically to prevent that fate from befalling their own country. But modernization required resources, raw materials, markets, economic space, and Japan's home islands were geographically limited. Expansion onto the Asian mainland, beginning with influence over Korea, looked like both an economic necessity and a marker of national prestige. A Japan that could project power over Korea was a Japan that had arrived as a serious state. A Japan pushed back from the peninsula by Russia was a Japan reminded of its limits. These competing visions collided most visibly in 1895, when Japan won a decisive war against China and, under the Treaty of Shimonoseki, gained control of the Liaodong Peninsula, the very territory that contained Port Arthur. Russia's response was immediate and revealing. Joined by France and Germany in what became known as the Triple Intervention, Russia pressured Japan to return the peninsula to China, arguing that Japanese control would threaten peace in the region. Japan complied, bitterly, and then just 3 years later, Russia leased that same Liaodong Peninsula from China for itself and established its naval base at Port Arthur. It would be difficult to overstate how that sequence was perceived in Japan. The message seemed unmistakable. Russia had stripped Japan of its victory, declared the territory a threat to stability when Japan held it, and then claimed it for its own. Whatever diplomatic language surrounded the Triple Intervention, the practical effect was to teach Japan that Russia would use its power to limit Japanese ambitions whenever convenient, and that restraint in dealing with Russia was not likely to be rewarded. Through the years that followed, both sides attempted negotiations while also preparing for the possibility, increasingly looking like a probability, that diplomacy would fail. Japan proposed various arrangements that would have acknowledged Russian interests in Manchuria in exchange for Russian recognition of Japanese primacy in Korea. Russia's responses were slow, often evasive, and reflected a broader attitude in St. Petersburg that was difficult to separate from condescension. There were figures in the Russian government who simply did not believe Japan posed a serious military threat. Tsar Nicholas II reportedly referred to the Japanese in terms that reflected a deep and consequential underestimation of their capabilities. The idea that a war with Japan would be a limited, winnable affair, perhaps even useful for rallying Russian public opinion, circulated in certain circles close to the Tsar. That attitude shaped how Russia negotiated, or failed to negotiate. Russian demands escalated even as Japan's patience wore thinner. At a critical moment in 1903 and into early 1904, when a negotiated settlement might still have been possible, Russia's responses to Japanese proposals came slowly and often walked back earlier concessions. Whether this reflected genuine strategic calculation, bureaucratic dysfunction, or a kind of imperial arrogance toward an opponent they didn't take seriously remains a matter of historical debate. Probably it was some combination of all three. What isn't really debated is the effect. Japan concluded correctly, as events proved that further diplomacy was unlikely to produce an agreement Russia would honour, and that Russia was using the negotiating process to buy time, while reinforcing its position in the region. The window in which Japan held a military advantage was not indefinitely wide. Russia's Trans-Siberian Railway would eventually be fully operational, making it far easier to move troops and supplies to the Far East. The moment to act, if Japan was going to act, was now. The stakes, understood clearly by both sides, went well beyond Korea and Manchuria. For Japan, this was a test of whether its decades of modernization had produced a state capable of standing up to a European great power, a question with implications that stretched across Asia, where the assumption of European military superiority was starting to look less automatic than it once had. For Russia, any failure against Japan would raise urgent questions about Tsarist authority at home, where revolutionary pressures were already building. Prestige wasn't merely a matter of national pride. For Nicholas II, maintaining Russia's image as a dominant power was intertwined with the domestic legitimacy of the regime itself. By early 1904, the collision that had been building for nearly a decade was no longer avoidable. The only real question was who would move first, and Japan had already decided. So Japan had decided to act. But before we follow that decision to its consequences, it's worth pausing on a question that tends to get overshadowed by the drama of the war itself. Even setting aside the diplomatic failures and the underestimation of Japan's capabilities, was Russia actually in a position to fight a major war at the far end of the continent? Because the geographic and logistical reality of Russia's situation in the Pacific was, on close inspection, something close to a structural disaster waiting to happen. Russia is often described as a land empire, and that description carries real meaning. Its strength had always been territorial depth, the ability to absorb pressure and project power across a vast continental interior, but projecting naval power and sustaining a military campaign at the eastern extremity of Asia required something fundamentally different. It required infrastructure, supply chains, and forward bases that could actually function under wartime pressure. What Russia had in the Far East by 1904 was, at best, a work in progress. Vladivostok was Russia's primary Pacific port, and it was in many ways an impressive symbol of imperial ambition. A city built essentially from nothing in the latter half of the 19th century, it sat at the end of the Trans-Siberian Railway and gave Russia a genuine Pacific presence. The problem was that Vladivostok froze for several months each year, which meant it couldn't serve as a reliable year-round naval base. Russia's Pacific Squadron stationed there was capable but constrained, capable of sorties and operations, but not of sustaining the kind of constant naval pressure that control of regional sea lanes would require. For that, Russia needed somewhere it could operate in all seasons. Port Arthur was meant to solve that problem. The warm water harbour on the Liaodong Peninsula was, in theory, exactly what Russian strategic planners had coveted, a year-round base that could anchor Russian naval power in the Yellow Sea and give the Pacific Fleet genuine operational flexibility. In practice, Port Arthur came with complications that grew more serious the harder you looked at them. The harbour entrance was awkward and shallow enough that larger warships had to be careful about the tides. The fortifications protecting the base were still being developed in 1904, rushed and incomplete in ways that would matter enormously once the war started. The city's infrastructure strained under the demands placed on it. And perhaps most critically, Port Arthur sat at the end of a long exposed logistical line, reachable from European Russia only through the Trans-Siberian Railway, which at the time still had a significant gap around Lake Baikal that required passengers and cargo to be transferred by ferry, a bottleneck that severely limited throughput. That railway gap is worth dwelling on because it captures something essential about Russia's Far Eastern predicament. The Trans-Siberian Railway was one of the great engineering projects of the age, a genuine feat of ambition and labour. But it wasn't finished. The Circum-Baikal section, which would eventually close the gap, was under construction, but not yet complete when war broke out. What this meant in practical terms was that Russia could not rapidly reinforce its Far Eastern forces the way a fully connected rail link would have allowed, moving troops, artillery, ammunition and supplies from European Russia to Manchuria was possible, but it was slow, laborious, and measured in weeks and months rather than days. Japan, which could move forces across relatively short sea lanes to the Korean peninsula and Manchuria, operated under no such constraint. The distance itself was almost incomprehensible in operational terms. From St. Petersburg to Port Arthur overland was something in the neighbourhood of 10,000 kilometres. The command structure reflected this distance in frustrating ways. Decisions made in the capital arrived late. Orders reflected conditions that had already changed, and local commanders found themselves caught between the reality in front of them and the expectations of authorities who were, quite literally, a continent away. Bureaucratic delay, which was a feature of the Russian imperial system even under ideal conditions, became genuinely crippling when every communication had to travel across that span. What makes all of this historically interesting is the question of whether Russian leaders genuinely understood these problems and accepted them as manageable risks, or whether they failed to reckon with them clearly. The evidence suggests something uncomfortable. There were people within the Russian military and government who did understand the logistical vulnerabilities and raised concerns about the readiness of Far Eastern forces. But those concerns were filtered through a command culture that was hierarchical, often resistant to unwelcome assessments, and, in the case of the Tsar's inner circle, influenced by a broader confidence that Russian prestige and mass would eventually overwhelm a smaller opponent. There's also the matter of naval geography in a more immediate sense. Russian naval strategy in the Pacific depended on the two squadrons, at Port Arthur and Vladivostok, being able to coordinate and combine. The problem was that those two bases were separated by a significant stretch of sea that was, in wartime, vulnerable to Japanese interdiction. Uniting the fleets under pressure was always going to be difficult. In a scenario where Japan struck quickly and aggressively, it might become impossible. Russia, in other words, had made substantial investments in Far Eastern power projection without fully solving the foundational problems that made that power projection viable. Port Arthur was symbolically important, but operationally fragile. The railway was transformative in its ambition, but not yet capable of sustaining a major war. The command structures were slow. The supply lines were long. And there seems to have been at the highest levels an incomplete accounting of what it would actually cost, in men, material, and time, to fight a determined modern opponent so far from the centres of Russian strength. Whether this amounted to simple overconfidence or reflected a more systemic failure of planning and institutional honesty is something historians have debated at length. Perhaps both are true simultaneously. Great empires have a way of mistaking the scale of their ambitions for the substance of their capabilities. What's clear is that when Japan finally moved, and moved with a speed and precision that caught Russia badly off balance, these accumulated vulnerabilities didn't just matter at the margins. They shaped everything that followed, including, eventually, the extraordinary decision to send a fleet from the Baltic Sea to try to retrieve what had already been lost. On the night of February 8, 1904, Japan didn't wait for diplomacy to finish running its course. Without a formal declaration of war, Japanese torpedo boats slipped into the outer roadstead of Port Arthur and attacked the Russian Pacific Squadron at anchor. 3 Russian warships were hit and put out of action. The attack didn't destroy the fleet outright, but it did something arguably more damaging in the immediate term. It announced, with jarring clarity, that Japan was willing to strike first, strike fast, and absorb whatever political consequences came from doing so. The declaration of war followed the attack, a reversal of the expected order that shocked European observers and infuriated Russian officials. In St. Petersburg, the sequence was read as a kind of treachery, a violation of the civilized norms that were supposed to govern relations between great powers. That reaction is telling in its own right. The outrage was genuine, but it also reflected something deeper, a failure to have seriously gamed out what it would look like if Japan took the initiative rather than waiting to respond to Russian pressure. Russia had been the more assertive power in the region for years, pushing into Manchuria, angling for influence in Korea, treating Japanese concerns with a mixture of condescension and indifference. That Japan might decide to act preemptively, rather than negotiate endlessly from a position of perceived weakness seems, in retrospect, like an obvious possibility. It apparently hadn't been processed as one. The Port Arthur attack was followed almost immediately by a Japanese landing in Korea, which demonstrated the operational ambition behind Japan's strategy. This wasn't a raid or a provocation designed to bring Russia to the table on better terms. This was the opening move of a campaign intended to establish Japanese military dominance on the Korean peninsula and ultimately force a confrontation in Manchuria on ground that Japan chose and at a tempo Japan controlled. Admiral Togo Haihachiro, commanding the Japanese combined fleet, followed up the torpedo boat attack with a surface engagement the next morning, and while Russian casualties were limited, the psychological effect of being caught flat-footed in their own harbour was significant. What happened at Port Arthur in those first hours of the war mattered not just as a military event, but as a statement about initiative. Russia had assumed, probably without stating it explicitly, that any confrontation would unfold at a pace that allowed Russian power to concentrate and assert itself. The Trans-Siberian Railway would move troops. The Pacific Squadron would sortie. Reinforcements would arrive. Time was on Russia's side. Japan's opening moves were a direct assault on that assumption. By striking before war was formally declared, by landing forces immediately, by pressing the naval advantage aggressively, Japan compressed the timeline in ways that gave Russia almost no opportunity to stabilize before the next blow landed. That next blow came at Kamolpo, modern-day Incheon, on the same day as the Port Arthur attack. Japanese forces overwhelmed the small Russian naval presence there, sinking the cruiser Variag and the gunboat Koreets, or rather forcing their crews to scuttle them rather than surrender. The Variag, in particular, became a rallying point for Russian patriotic sentiment. Her crew celebrated as heroes who fought against impossible odds, which is true enough as far as it goes. But the sentiment also served a purpose in Russia. It allowed the shock of the opening days to be partially absorbed into a narrative of brave resistance, which softened the more uncomfortable reality that Japan had, in 2 days, secured the sea approaches to Korea and badly disrupted Russian naval operations in the Yellow Sea. Admiral Makarov, one of the more capable Russian naval commanders, arrived at Port Arthur in late February to try to restore some operational coherence to the battered Pacific Squadron. He was aggressive by temperament, determined to contest Japanese dominance of the approaches rather than shelter the fleet behind the harbour defences. There was a brief period in which it seemed like he might genuinely reshape the situation. Then, on April 13th, his flagship Petropavlovsk struck a Japanese mine outside the harbour entrance and sank within minutes. Makarov went down with it. The loss of the one admiral who seemed capable of driving the Pacific Squadron into effective action was a blow from which Russian naval operations in the region never really recovered. On land, the picture was no less troubling. Japanese forces moved northward from Korea with purpose and coordination, and the early engagements in Manchuria demonstrated that the Russian army, brave and often tenacious at the individual level, was hampered by poor command decisions, supply difficulties, and the same structural problems that had characterized the Russian Far Eastern position from the beginning. The gap around Lake Baikal was still being bridged. Reinforcements were arriving, but slowly. Commanders were rotated. Plans were adjusted. None of it cohered into anything that could reverse the Japanese advantage. In St. Petersburg, the first weeks of the war produced a kind of escalating dismay that the government worked hard to contain publicly, while struggling privately with the recognition that things had gone wrong very quickly. Tsar Nicholas II had been assured, in various forms and by various advisers, that Japan would back down, that Russian prestige would assert itself, that the situation was manageable. The early military reports made those assurances increasingly difficult to maintain. The Japanese weren't backing down. They were, by every available measure, fighting with a skill, determination, and strategic coherence that Russian planning had apparently not fully anticipated. What this produced in St. Petersburg was urgency, the uncomfortable, pressured kind that comes from watching a situation deteriorate, and knowing that the mechanisms you assumed would correct it aren't working. The Pacific Squadron was damaged and effectively bottled up. The army in Manchuria was under pressure and not yet at full strength. Port Arthur itself was beginning to look less like a forward base and more like a potential liability, a garrison waiting to be besieged rather than a platform for offensive operations. And Japan controlled enough of the surrounding sea to make resupply and reinforcement by water essentially impossible. There was, in theory, one lever that St. Petersburg had not yet pulled: Russia's Baltic Fleet, its most powerful naval force. The fleet that represented the real weight of Russian sea power was sitting in the Baltic, nowhere near the war. The logic of sending it east was obvious enough. The complications of doing so were, as Russia was about to discover, something else entirely. The question that hung over St. Petersburg in the spring and summer of 1904 was deceptively simple. What do you do when the war you assumed you would win starts going wrong faster than your plans can absorb? Accepting local defeat wasn't really a political option, at least not in the way that phrase might suggest a rational calculation being weighed against alternatives. Russia in 1904 was not a state that processed military setback through calm institutional deliberation. It was an autocracy under a Tsar who had personal investment in the Far Eastern expansion, surrounded by court circles whose influence depended on projecting confidence, operating in a domestic environment where public prestige and the appearance of strength were bound up with the regime's legitimacy in ways that made retreat feel like something far more dangerous than a tactical adjustment. Acknowledging that Japan had outmaneuvered Russia in its own backyard, that the forward position in Manchuria and Korea, the lease on Port Arthur, the whole expensive architecture of Russian Far Eastern ambition might simply be lost, was a conclusion the government was structurally unprepared to reach. Nicholas II himself is a complicated figure through which to read these decisions. He was not a man of strong strategic vision or decisive character, but he was genuinely convinced of Russia's mission in the East, and he was surrounded by advisers who had spent years feeding that conviction. The war had been, in some court circles, almost welcomed as an opportunity, a short, victorious war, as Interior Minister Plehve allegedly framed it, that might redirect domestic restlessness outward and reinforce the monarchy's standing. That framing collapsed within weeks of the opening engagements, but the emotional and political investment it represented didn't dissolve with it. If anything, early setbacks made the pressure to recover prestige more acute rather than less. Into this environment came the question of the Baltic Fleet. The arguments in favour of sending it were not entirely without strategic logic. The Pacific Squadron, even in its battered state, still tied up Japanese naval attention. If the Baltic Fleet could fight its way through to Vladivostok, and combine with whatever remained of the Far Eastern forces, Japan would face a naval threat it couldn't afford to ignore. The supply lines that sustained Japanese operations in Manchuria depended on sea control. Challenge that control seriously, and the whole strategic picture might shift. The Japanese army could advance on land, but it couldn't be maintained indefinitely if Russian naval power forced Togo to divide his attention and resources. That was the optimistic version, and it circulated in St. Petersburg with enough credibility to provide cover for a decision that was probably being driven by forces less strategic than they appeared. Because the honest assessment of the Baltic Fleet's prospects, had anyone been inclined to press for one, was not encouraging. The fleet was powerful on paper, built around modern battleships that compared reasonably well with Japanese counterparts on technical specifications. But the ships had varying levels of crew readiness. Many of the sailors had limited sea experience. The officer corps was uneven. The fleet had no coaling stations along the route it would have to take. The journey itself, around Europe, down the African coast, across the Indian Ocean, and into Pacific waters controlled by an enemy that would know exactly where it was going, was of a length and logistical complexity that no Russian fleet had ever attempted. These complications were known. They were discussed at least at the planning level. The weight given to them in the final decision tells you something about what the decision was actually about. A purely strategic calculus might have produced a different answer, or at least a much more qualified endorsement of the voyage. What actually drove the order forward was something closer to a combination of desperation and symbolism, the need to be seen doing something commensurate with the scale of what was at stake, the need to send a signal to Japan, to European observers, and to the Russian public that the Empire was not conceding the contest. There's a version of this that treats the decision as straightforwardly irrational, a product of imperial hubris disconnected from military reality. That reading isn't entirely wrong, but it flattens some genuine uncertainty. In the summer of 1904, the war's outcome was not yet determined. Port Arthur was besieged but hadn't fallen. The army in Manchuria was being pushed back but hadn't broken. It was at least plausible from a St. Petersburg perspective that Russian land forces might stabilize, that Japan would face its own exhaustion, that the arrival of the Baltic Fleet could tip a still contested situation, rather than simply prolonging an already lost one. These weren't certainties, but they were possibilities, and war has a way of making people weight possibilities more generously than strict probability would justify. What's harder to excuse is the refusal to seriously interrogate the conditions under which the fleet would be fighting when it arrived. The plan assumed the fleet would reach the Far East in a condition capable of engaging Togo's combined fleet, a force that had spent months operating together, that knew its home waters, that had had time to drill and coordinate and prepare. The Baltic Fleet would be arriving after a voyage of 7 months or more, with coal-stained hulls, crews worn by months at sea, machinery stressed by tropical heat and inadequate maintenance opportunities, and morale shaped by the knowledge that the war they'd been sent to influence might already be decided. These were not abstract concerns. They were the predictable consequences of the voyage itself, whether they were fully weighed, or whether they were noted and then set aside in the rush to act, is one of the more troubling questions that hangs over the decision. What is clear is that by the autumn of 1904, the political machinery had committed to the voyage in a way that made reversal almost unthinkable. The fleet had been presented to the public as Russia's answer to Japanese aggression. The Tsar had invested his prestige in it. Turning the ships around would have required admitting not just that the mission was too difficult, but that it had been misconceived from the beginning, and that was a kind of honesty that St. Petersburg wasn't prepared for. So the Baltic Fleet would sail, not because anyone could demonstrate convincingly that it would succeed, but because the alternative, accepting that Russia's Far Eastern position was simply lost, carried political costs that the regime found harder to contemplate than the risks of the voyage itself. That distinction between decisions made for strategic reasons and decisions made to avoid the consequences of not deciding would follow the fleet across every ocean between home and Tsushima. On paper, the 2nd Pacific Squadron was an impressive force. It included several of the most modern battleships the Russian Empire had built, vessels whose armour and armament placed them in credible comparison with anything Japan could field. When naval analysts in European capitals looked at the specifications, tonnage, gun calibers, theoretical rate of fire, the fleet appeared to constitute a genuine fighting force capable, at least in principle, of contesting the waters around Japan. That was the paper version. The reality assembling in the Baltic ports through the summer and autumn of 1904 was considerably more complicated. The fleet's composition was itself a source of problems that no amount of optimism could entirely paper over. At its core were the 4 Borodino-class battleships Knyaz Suvorov, Imperator Alexander III, Borodino and Oriol, modern ships that represented real investment in Russian naval construction. These were genuinely capable vessels, though even they carried a specific concern that was understood before departure. They were top-heavy, their weight distribution a consequence of design choices that made them handle poorly in heavy seas and raised questions about their stability under combat conditions. The Oriol, which would become one of the better documented ships of the voyage through an account left by a junior officer aboard, was still receiving final fittings and corrections as the fleet prepared to leave. Workmen were aboard completing tasks that should have been finished months earlier. Around these newer ships clustered a collection of older battleships and armoured cruisers whose value was considerably more debatable. Vessels like the Oslebia and the Navarin were serviceable in their own era, but represented an older generation of design, slower and less capable of absorbing punishment by the standards of 1904. Then there were the coastal defence battleships, the Ushakov, the Senyavin, the Apraxin, craft designed for littoral operations, for shallow waters and harbour defence, not for open ocean voyaging across hemispheres. Including them in a fleet bound for the Pacific reflected either a shortage of alternatives or a preference for numbers over coherence, and possibly both. Whatever the reasoning, these ships would struggle with the voyage in ways that were entirely predictable in advance. Supporting all of this were cruisers, destroyers, and a train of auxiliary vessels, colliers, hospital ships, repair ships, tugs, that would accompany the fleet and attempt to solve, at sea, the logistical challenges that no friendly port could address. This auxiliary train was essential precisely because Russia had no coaling stations along the route the fleet would take, a fact that transformed an already ambitious mission into something logistically extraordinary. The fleet would not be sailing to a destination so much as sustaining itself in motion, refuelling from its own supply ships in open water, in conditions that ranged from the North Sea to the tropics to the South Atlantic. It was an undertaking that tested every aspect of the fleet's organisation and competence before a single Japanese gun was fired in its direction. The crew situation added layers of difficulty that the raw personnel numbers didn't capture. The Russian Navy in 1904 drew much of its enlisted manpower from conscripts with limited maritime background, men from interior provinces, from peasant communities, without experience of the sea before their service began. This was not unique to Russia among major naval powers of the era, but it placed a particular burden on the training regimen, one that required sustained, rigorous preparation to overcome. That preparation had not been consistently delivered. Many of the crews had inadequate gunnery practice, a deficiency that would prove catastrophic at Tsushima, but was already visible to those who observed fleet exercises before departure. Rates of fire, accuracy, damage control procedures, these required repetition to become reliable under pressure, and the time and resources devoted to drilling had not matched the ambition of the mission. The officer corps was uneven in ways that reflected broader tensions in the Russian Navy's culture. There were competent, experienced officers scattered through the fleet, men who understood their ships and took their professional responsibilities seriously. There were also officers whose positions owed more to social connection and seniority than to demonstrated ability, a pattern that bedeviled many of the European imperial navies of the period, but had particular consequences in a force about to undertake something this demanding. The gap between the best and worst officers in the fleet was wide enough to matter operationally, and in an enterprise where coordination and consistent execution would be tested continuously. That unevenness was not a minor concern. Maintenance and material readiness presented their own complications. Some ships had machinery that required attention before they could be considered fully operational. The dockyard capacity available in Russia, stretched by years of competing demands and the costs of earlier naval construction programs, had not been equal to the task of preparing every vessel to the same standard. Ships departed with known deficiencies, with the understanding, or perhaps the hope, that repairs could be managed en route or deferred until arrival. This was a gamble whose terms would become clearer the farther from home the fleet travelled and the fewer options for correction remained. What made all of these individual problems more serious was the specific nature of the mission that was compounding them. A fleet with these characteristics, sailing to a nearby port for a defined engagement, might have managed its weaknesses within acceptable boundaries. What the 2nd Pacific Squadron was actually being asked to do was different in kind. A voyage of nearly 18,000 miles, through waters ranging from subarctic to tropical, lasting months, with no friendly ports, no resupply infrastructure, no opportunity for the kind of sustained maintenance that keeps machinery reliable and culminating in a major fleet engagement against an enemy that had been preparing and drilling specifically for that encounter. Each weakness in training, each maintenance deferral, each mismatch between a ship's design and the conditions it would face, these problems didn't simply accumulate additively over the length of the voyage. They interacted, compounding one another in ways that eroded the fleet's fighting capacity steadily and relentlessly, before a single shell was fired in anger. A crew that began the voyage underprepared would arrive exhausted and further degraded. Machinery that left the Baltic with known issues would face tropical heat, sustained operation, and no dry dock for months. The fleet that St. Petersburg was presenting to the public as Russia's decisive naval response to Japan was real enough in its component ships and men. But the gap between what those assets represented in theory and what they could actually deliver under the conditions of this mission was a gap that the decision-makers in the capital either could not see clearly or chose not to examine too closely. The voyage would force that examination whether anyone wanted it or not. The fleet that existed on paper needed a commander who could transform it into something coherent enough to fight. The man the Imperial Navy selected for that task was Vice Admiral Zinovy Petrovich Rozhestvensky, and few appointments in Russian naval history have generated more debate about whether the choice was inspired, desperate, or simply unavoidable. Rozhestvensky was not an obscure figure when he received command of the 2nd Pacific Squadron. He had built a genuine reputation within the Navy as a demanding administrator and a capable organizer, qualities that had earned him the position of Chief of the Naval General Staff before the war began. He had also demonstrated personal courage under fire during earlier service. His conduct during the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 had been noted and decorated. These were not phantom credentials. He was, in certain important respects, exactly the kind of officer the Russian Navy needed to take a fractured, underprepared fleet and drive it through 18,000 miles of ocean. Those who served under him described a man of extraordinary energy, someone who seemed to will the fleet forward through force of personality when institutional and logistical realities argued for standing still. He worked brutal hours. He involved himself in the operational details that other admirals might have delegated. When harbour authorities were slow, when coal contracts were tangled, when bureaucratic obstacles multiplied, and they would multiply constantly, it was Rozhestvensky's personal intervention that cut through. There is real evidence that the fleet moved at all, and moved as far as it did, largely because of one man's capacity for sustained, grinding work. A less energetic commander might have watched the whole enterprise collapse in the Baltic before it reached open water. But there were other dimensions to Rozhestvensky's character that pointed towards serious trouble. He was famously, almost pathologically, difficult to work with. His temper was volcanic and unpredictable. He treated subordinate officers with a contempt that went beyond demanding standards into something closer to systematic humiliation. Constructive criticism, the kind of honest exchange that might have identified problems before they became crises, effectively did not exist in his command environment. Officers who might have offered useful observations about ship readiness, crew training, or tactical planning kept their doubts to themselves rather than face a response that was as likely to be explosive as it was to be rational. The culture he created around himself was one of fearful compliance rather than professional confidence. This mattered in ways that compounded the fleet's existing vulnerabilities. A fleet preparing for a major engagement needs officers who will surface problems honestly, who will advocate for necessary preparation even when doing so is uncomfortable, who will flag the gap between what their crews can currently do and what the mission will require of them. Rozhestvensky's manner made this kind of communication difficult at precisely the moment it was most necessary. The silences around him were not the silences of men who had nothing to say. They were the silences of men who had learned that saying it wasn't worth the cost. There is also a genuine question, one that historians have returned to repeatedly, about whether Rozhestvensky's particular skills were the right ones for the specific task he faced. He was a superb organizer in conditions where organization could solve problems. The deeper issue the 2nd Pacific Squadron confronted was that many of its problems could not be organized away. Ships that were top-heavy remained top-heavy. Crews that had been undertrained before departure could not be transformed during a voyage that left almost no time for sustained drilling. The political and strategic pressures bearing down on the fleet, the expectation of a decisive engagement, the eyes of Europe watching, the desperation of a Russian government whose land war in Manchuria was not going well. These were not logistical challenges that could be managed through better paperwork and harder hours. The question of whether he was the right man is further complicated by the uncomfortable reality that the field of alternatives was not obviously stronger. Russian naval leadership in 1904 was not overflowing with figures who combined operational experience, organizational capability, and the political standing necessary to command an enterprise this significant. Some historians have argued that Rozhestvensky was genuinely the best available option given real constraints, that condemning him means imagining an alternative that didn't actually exist. Others have suggested that different leadership might have approached the fleet's limitations more honestly, might have pressed harder for delay and better preparation, might have at least opened the possibility of a different tactical approach when engagement finally came. The debate remains genuinely unresolved. What is less debatable is the psychological weight that accumulated on him personally. Rozhestvensky appears to have understood, with a clarity he rarely communicated openly, how fragile the enterprise actually was. Several accounts suggest a man who had few illusions about the fleet's condition, even as he drove it forward. His private communications carry a tone that differs noticeably from the official optimism, something closer to a man who knew the odds and had decided to see the thing through anyway, not because he believed in the outcome, but because someone had to do it and he had been given the task. That combination, exhausting operational burdens, a corrosive leadership style, political pressures from St. Petersburg that never relented, and a privately held awareness that the whole thing might end badly, produced a commander under a strain that is difficult to fully reconstruct, but was clearly visible to those around him as the voyage progressed. The fleet's effectiveness would depend on the quality of his decisions across months of accumulated pressure, in situations for which no planning could fully account. Whether Rozhestvensky had the particular kind of resilience those conditions demanded was something that could only be answered by the voyage itself. The fleet was built on uncertain foundations. The man chosen to lead it was a figure of real capability and real limitation, carrying a burden that might have broken anyone. What happened when those realities met the open ocean, and eventually the guns of the Japanese fleet, was about to begin. When the 2nd Pacific Squadron finally departed Libau in October of 1904, there was no triumphant send-off of the kind that might have stirred the crews into confidence. The mood surrounding the departure was something closer to a collective exhale of relief that the waiting, which had dragged on through delays, bureaucratic tangles, and endless incomplete preparations, was finally over. Whether the fleet was truly ready was a question most people involved had quietly stopped asking, because the answer kept coming back uncomfortable and the political pressure to simply move had become overwhelming. So they moved. From the first days at sea, the atmosphere aboard the ships was shaped by something that went beyond ordinary pre-battle nerves. The Russian naval command had convinced itself, with a thoroughness that now seems almost remarkable, that Japanese torpedo boats had infiltrated European waters. The logic was not entirely irrational on its face. Japan had purchased ships from European yards, had agents in European ports, had demonstrated during the opening of the war a particular talent for the kind of sudden, nighttime torpedo strike that had devastated the Russian squadron at Port Arthur in February. What the command failed to do was apply proportionate skepticism to the specific intelligence being fed to them, much of which was wild, unverified, and in retrospect almost certainly fabricated or wildly distorted. The result was a fleet sailing through the North Sea in a state of armed paranoia. Lookouts were posted in conditions of extreme anxiety. Officers issued warnings about suspicious vessels with a frequency that bore little relationship to the actual threat environment. the North Sea at night, crossed by fishing fleets, coastal steamers, and the ordinary maritime traffic of one of the world's busiest waterways, became in the imaginations of exhausted, frightened men a sea of potential enemies. Every light on the horizon invited suspicion. Every unexpected shape in the darkness was a possible torpedo boat preparing to finish what Port Arthur had started. There were practical reasons why the fear ran so deep. The crews of the 2nd Pacific Squadron had not spent significant time at sea before this voyage. Many of the reservists called up to fill the billets were not seasoned sailors with the accumulated calm of men who have spent years reading the difference between a fishing trawler and a warship. They were nervous men carrying rifles and torpedoes and live ammunition through unfamiliar waters, commanded by officers who were themselves operating under the pressure Rozhestvensky generated. That atmosphere of fearful compliance rather than professional confidence. When rumours circulated through the lower decks, as they did constantly, there was no thick layer of experienced, settled naval culture to absorb and moderate them. The rumours became reality faster than anyone could contain. The poor preparation that had plagued the fleet before departure now manifested in subtler but consequential ways. Communication between ships was unreliable. Coordination that should have been practiced until it was automatic had simply not been practiced enough. When signals were sent, they were sometimes misread. When formations were ordered, they were sometimes not maintained. The fleet that had looked impressive in harbour, or at least more impressive than it actually was, began revealing its fractures the moment it encountered the ordinary operational demands of moving through open water at night, while in a heightened state of alert. These were not catastrophic failures individually. Together they created an environment in which a serious mistake was not just possible, but perhaps inevitable. What came next would shock European opinion and force Russia into a diplomatic crisis it was entirely unprepared to handle. But to understand how it happened, it helps to sit with the accumulated pressure that had been building since Libau. The sleep deprivation, the unrelenting anxiety about torpedo attacks, the rumours that circulated below decks and worked their way into officers' reports, the communications failures, the absence of the kind of practiced, automatic competence that comes only from real sea time, and overarching all of it, a commander whose manner made honest professional judgment harder to surface. Just when the fleet needed it most. All of those threads were woven tightly together by the time the fleet entered the waters south of Dogger Bank in the North Sea on the night of October 21st to 22nd. Rozhestvensky himself was almost certainly aware that his command was operating in a dangerously heightened state. His own intelligence summaries had contained warnings about Japanese torpedo boats. Whether he genuinely credited them at this point, or whether he had begun to distrust the quality of his intelligence, is not entirely clear from surviving accounts. What is clear is that the operational environment he had created, intentionally or not, had produced a fleet primed to see threats that weren't there. The question was where and when that priming would discharge. There is something almost classically tragic about the sequence of events taking shape. The fears that haunted the crews were not groundless inventions from nothing. They grew from real experiences earlier in the war and from genuine uncertainty about what Japanese agents in Europe might be capable of. But the fears had grown well beyond what the evidence warranted. Fed by poor intelligence, institutional anxiety, undertrained crews, and a voyage that had stripped away the normal stabilizing routines before they were ever properly established. The fleet was travelling through one of the most densely trafficked bodies of water in the world at night, with live weapons, in a state of collective hypervigilance that had no professional discipline strong enough to hold it in check. The international incident that was about to erupt from those conditions would briefly threaten to add Britain to the list of Russia's enemies, which would have ended the Baltic Fleet's mission before it properly began, and perhaps changed the trajectory of the war in ways that are genuinely difficult to predict. The fact that it didn't fully escalate into something catastrophic diplomatically was due less to Russian management of the situation than to the eventual pragmatic calculations of governments, more interested in their broader strategic interests than in punishing humiliation. But the damage to the fleet's position, its morale, and its already shaky international standing would be real and lasting. The Voyage had barely cleared European waters, and it had already produced a crisis. Everything that followed, the coal stops, the months at sea, the growing exhaustion, the encounter off the coast of Korea, was being built on this foundation of tension, confusion, and a collective psychology that had been stressed almost from the first night at sea. On that October night, the fleet was moving through calm, dark water, when lookouts aboard the lid vessels reported shapes emerging from the darkness, small craft, moving without clear identification, scattered across the fleet's path in the way that, to men already wounded to breaking point, could fit the mental template of torpedo boats preparing to attack. What those lookouts were actually seeing was the Hull fishing fleet, working the Dogger Bank as it had done for generations, their small steam trawlers going about entirely ordinary business in waters they had every right to occupy. The fishermen, who had no particular reason to expect that a nervous armada would materialize out of the night and mistake them for a Japanese strike force, had no idea what was about to happen to them. The Russian ships opened fire. Searchlights swept across the water, catching the trawlers in sudden blinding light, and then the guns opened up and kept firing for somewhere around 20 minutes. The trawler crane was sunk. Several others were damaged. 2 British fishermen were killed, several more wounded. Among the chaos, Russian ships appear to have fired on each other. The cruiser Aurora, which was herself part of the fleet, took hits from Russian guns, and at least 1 Russian sailor died and several were wounded in the confusion of the fleet shooting into its own formation. The explanation for how it happened is not simple, but it isn't mysterious either. The crews had been operating for days at a pitch of anxiety that had been deliberately maintained rather than professionally managed. The intelligence assessments circulating through the fleet had primed officers and lookouts to see Japanese torpedo craft in ambiguous shapes at night. When the trawlers appeared, and they would have looked unusual from a distance, their lights positioned and their silhouettes shaped in ways different from what Russian sailors were accustomed to, there was no adequate cognitive or institutional break to slow the reaction. No one apparently stopped to ask why Japanese torpedo boats would be operating in the middle of the North Sea rather than, say, anywhere near Japan. No one apparently pressed hard enough on the obvious question of how vessels matching this description had managed to travel thousands of miles, undetected, and position themselves precisely in the fleet's path. The institutional conditions that might have produced that kind of critical pressure, the expectation that officers should think independently, should challenge assumptions, should demand better evidence before opening fire, were not present. What was present was fear, darkness, exhaustion, and a commander whose style of authority had done nothing to cultivate the kind of professional confidence that could hold a frightened crew in check. There is an argument sometimes made in defense of Rozhestvensky and his officers that the intelligence warnings about Japanese torpedo boats operating in European waters had come from official Russian naval intelligence sources, and that a responsible commander was obliged to take those warnings seriously. This is not entirely wrong as a point of procedure. What it misses is that the warnings had been evaluated by some observers even at the time as almost certainly fabricated or wildly distorted, and that a more professionally robust command culture would have applied proportionate skepticism rather than treating every unverified report as confirmed threat. The fleet arrived at Dogger Bank in the state it did not, because one piece of intelligence was wrong, but because no adequate filtering process existed between raw, unreliable intelligence and operational action. The diplomatic fallout was immediate and severe. Britain was not a neutral power in the way that some more distant nations were. The Anglo-Japanese alliance, signed in 1902, formally aligned British interests with Japanese ones, and the killing of British subjects in British waters by Russian warships was the kind of incident that could, under different circumstances, have pulled 2 great empires toward open conflict. The British public was furious. The press was furious. The Royal Navy shadowed the Russian fleet as it continued south, a pointed demonstration of the capacity Britain had to act if it chose, for several days. The question of whether this would escalate into something far larger than a diplomatic row was genuinely open. Russia's handling of the immediate crisis was not particularly graceful. Initial Russian accounts included suggestions that Japanese torpedo boats had indeed been present, a claim that convinced no one who had access to the actual physical evidence, which consisted of traumatized British fishermen and their damaged trawlers rather than anything resembling an enemy warship. The gap between the Russian explanation and observable reality was wide enough to generate its own kind of damage, adding an impression of dishonesty or delusion to the impression of incompetence. What ultimately prevented escalation was not Russian diplomatic skill, but British strategic calculation. Britain had interests in managing the Russian relationship, particularly given the broader European dynamics taking shape in those years, and a full diplomatic rupture over the incident would have complicated those interests in ways the British government found unpalatable. An international commission of inquiry was eventually convened. Russia paid compensation to the victims and their families, and the matter was formally resolved through mechanisms designed to let both sides step back from the edge. The compensation was real, the formal resolution was real, but the underlying impression that Russia had sailed a panicked, undertrained fleet into the North Sea and shot up British fishing boats was not something any commission could undo. What the incident revealed went well beyond the immediate night of confusion. It showed that the 2nd Pacific Squadron was operating with a discipline gap between what was required and what was actually available, that the combination of inexperienced crews, poor intelligence processes, and a command culture that rewarded compliance over judgment had produced a formation capable of catastrophic mistakes in conditions far less demanding than actual battle. If this was how the fleet performed in relatively familiar waters, under the relatively manageable stress of a transit voyage, the question of how it would perform against Togo's experienced, well-drilled fleet in actual combat conditions was one that the incident planted clearly in the minds of outside observers, if not sufficiently in the minds of those responsible for the answer. The fleet continued south, trailed by British warships for a while, and then left to proceed on its own, carrying with it the accumulated weight of what had already gone wrong. The voyage had barely started. The distance to Tsushima was almost inconceivably vast, and the crew, the officers, and the admiral had already demonstrated in the most public and costly way possible that the gap between this fleet on paper and this fleet in practice was not a minor administrative shortfall. It was a chasm that would need to be crossed somehow before they arrived at the one place where none of that could be hidden. The fleet's problems were not limited to the things that could go wrong in a moment of panic. Some of its deepest vulnerabilities were structural, built into the nature of the voyage itself, and they would grind away at men and machinery across months with the slow, unspectacular efficiency of something that doesn't announce itself until the damage is already done. Chief among these was coal. For a steam-powered warship of the early 20th century, coal was not simply fuel, it was the boundary condition of everything. A ship without coal was a floating, defenseless target. A fleet that couldn't reliably source coal on a voyage of this length couldn't reliably reach its destination, let alone fight when it got there. And the 2nd Pacific Squadron was attempting something that had not really been done before at this scale, moving a major naval force from one side of the world to the other across tens of thousands of miles of ocean, mostly without access to friendly ports. Russia's geography made this problem acute in a way that wasn't true for the British or the French, or any colonial power, with a convenient string of coaling stations distributed across the globe. The Royal Navy had built an infrastructure of coaling stations over generations, threading its empire with supply points that meant a British fleet could travel almost anywhere without facing the raw logistical anxiety that haunted Rozhestvensky's voyage from the start. Russia had no comparable network. Its access to neutral ports was politically constrained by its war with Japan. Many nations with port facilities had little interest in allowing a belligerent fleet to restock on their territory, partly from genuine neutrality, and partly because the Anglo-Japanese alliance meant that accommodating Russia too openly carried its own diplomatic costs. The solution the Russian Navy arranged was the use of colliers, vessels chartered specifically to carry coal, and rendezvous with the fleet at pre-arranged points. On paper, this was workable. In practice, it created an almost continuous source of difficulty and delay. Coaling at sea from a collier was not a clean, efficient operation. It meant bringing two ships alongside each other in open water, often in conditions far from ideal, and transferring coal by hand, shoveling, hauling, heaving, in a process that was filthy, exhausting, and time-consuming. The coal dust got into everything, into the ventilation systems, into the food, into the lungs of men who were already doing this in tropical heat. Every major coaling operation left the crews depleted, and the ships visibly grimier. And these operations were not occasional interruptions in the voyage. They were recurring events, happening again and again across different ocean zones, eating time and wearing down the men responsible for making the fleet function. What made the situation worse was that Rozhestvensky, acutely aware of his dependence on coal and fearful of being caught short at a critical moment, became something of a coal hoarder in practice. Ships were ordered to take on coal at almost every available opportunity, loading well beyond their designed capacity. Battleships stacked coal in passageways, in spaces not intended for it, in whatever volume they could absorb. This had obvious safety implications. Coal piled in the wrong places creates fire risk, stability risk, and it degraded the living conditions of men who were already managing in confined spaces under difficult circumstances. But it also spoke to how completely the logistical anxiety of the voyage dominated decisions that, in other circumstances, might have been made differently. Then there were the mechanical realities of ships that had been built and maintained by a navy not known for the highest standards of industrial precision. The Baltic Fleet's vessels varied considerably in their actual condition. Some were relatively modern and reasonably sound. Others had issues that were known before departure and had been accepted because there wasn't a workable alternative. All of them, regardless of their starting state, were being subjected to months of continuous steaming across multiple ocean environments, from the cold North Sea to the tropics, through currents and conditions and accumulated stress that ships kept in ordinary service might face over years rather than months. Hull fouling was one of the more insidious problems. In tropical waters, the organisms that attach themselves to a ship's hull below the waterline grow with remarkable speed, and the resistance they create is not trivial. A heavily fouled hull requires more fuel to maintain a given speed, and simply cannot achieve the same top speed as a clean one. Ideally, a fleet undertaking this kind of voyage would have regular opportunities to dry dock vessels and clean their hulls. The 2nd Pacific Squadron had essentially no such opportunities. The fouling accumulated throughout the voyage, quietly robbing the ships of efficiency that could never be recovered without facilities that weren't available. Mechanical breakdowns and wear accumulated in similar fashion. Engines that needed attention, boilers developing problems, components showing the strain of extended operation beyond normal service intervals. These things were managed by the engineering crews as best they could manage them, but management under these conditions was inherently improvised. Spare parts were limited. Replacement of major components was essentially impossible. Repairs were patches applied to problems that, in port and with proper resources, would have warranted more thorough attention. With each passing week, the gap between the fleet's theoretical capability and its actual operational readiness widened slightly. What all of this meant, the coaling operations, the hull fouling, the mechanical strain, the repairs that were never quite adequate, was that the fleet arriving eventually in Asian waters was not quite the fleet that had left the Baltic. The numbers on paper, the tonnage and the gun calibers, and the count of vessels looked much the same. But the numbers on paper had never entirely described a fleet that was going to be competitive against Japan's navy, and the physical attrition of the voyage had done nothing to help the gap. The ships were slower than they should have been. The engineering crews were tired. The coal anxiety was constant and unresolved. It is worth pausing on this because the story of Tsushima is often told as a battle story, as a question of tactics and leadership and firepower on a single dramatic day. Those things mattered. But the foundation beneath the battle had been laid across months of accumulated logistical strain that no tactical genius could have simply overridden. A fleet is not just what it carries on its manifest. It is also what it costs to keep moving, and the 2nd Pacific Squadron had been paying that cost in ways that don't make for dramatic narration, but that shaped everything that followed. The logistical strain had a human face, and it wasn't a composed one. Behind every overloaded coal bunker and fouled hull, and improvised repair, was a crew of men living through conditions that, even by the standards of naval service in that era, were genuinely punishing. The physical environment aboard the ships of the 2nd Pacific Squadron across those months was the kind of thing that gets described in official reports with careful understatement and in private letters and diaries with considerably more candour. Heat was perhaps the most relentless enemy in the early stages of the voyage south. As the fleet moved through tropical latitudes, the temperature inside the ships, particularly below decks, near the engine rooms and boiler spaces, climbed to levels that were not merely uncomfortable, but physiologically dangerous. These were not ships designed with tropical service as their primary purpose. Ventilation was inadequate. The coal piled in unusual places made the airflow worse. Men working in the engineering spaces did so in conditions that would today be considered medically hazardous, and they did so continuously, watch after watch, day after day. Heat exhaustion was a real presence, not a theoretical risk. The food situation deteriorated as the voyage extended. Provisioning a fleet across this kind of distance, without reliable access to fresh supplies at regular intervals, meant a gradual shift toward preserved and canned goods that provided nutrition in the technical sense, while offering very little in the way of palatability. Fresh vegetables and meat became intermittent luxuries, dependent on what could be sourced at whatever port or anchorage was available at any given moment. The dietary monotony compounded everything else: the boredom, the physical fatigue, the psychological stress of a voyage that seemed to stretch forward without a clear end. Disease was a genuine concern, though its impact varied across the squadron. Tropical diseases, intestinal illness from food and water quality issues, and the general tendency of crowded ships to circulate infections through their crews were all factors that required management. The fleet's medical resources were not negligible, but they were also not unlimited, and the conditions were not those under which maintaining crew health was straightforward. Men who fell ill and recovered were not necessarily restored to full effectiveness. There was no opportunity for the kind of recuperation that might have returned them to full strength. Beneath all of this ran the deeper erosion of morale. Morale in a military force is not simply a matter of attitude. It is a functional element of combat effectiveness, connected to how men perform under pressure, whether they follow complex instructions under stress, whether unit cohesion holds when circumstances become chaotic, and the conditions of the voyage were systematically working against it. Monotony was its own weapon. Weeks at sea with the same faces, the same routine, the same horizon, the same tasks, eroded the edge that training and discipline were supposed to maintain. Men who might have performed competently in a fleet that had drilled regularly and rested properly were arriving at their destination in a condition that was a degraded version of what they might have been. The inexperience built into the fleet compounded this in specific and consequential ways. Gunnery, in any navy of this period, was a skill that required consistent practice to maintain at a meaningful level. The theoretical ability to operate a gun and the practical ability to hit something with it under the conditions of actual combat, ship moving, target moving, smoke and noise and stress, were quite different things. The 2nd Pacific Squadron's gunnery practice during the voyage was constrained by a number of factors: ammunition concerns, operational circumstances, the general disruption of long passages. The drills that did take place revealed problems that were not encouraging. Coordination between ships during exercises showed the kind of gaps that you would expect from a force that had not trained together extensively before being thrown into a common enterprise. There were also tensions within the command structure that filtered downward and affected the fleet's internal atmosphere. Rozhestvensky was not a leader who inspired warmth or confidence through personal manner. He was demanding, frequently furious, and the communications flowing from his flagship to the other vessels of the squadron were often sharp in their criticism and short in their acknowledgement of difficulty. Officers who had concerns about the state of their ships or the readiness of their crews faced a command environment in which raising those concerns too openly carried its own risks. The result was a kind of suppression, not of the problems themselves, but of the frank discussion of them that might at least have allowed realistic planning. There is something particularly corrosive about sailing toward an objective that becomes harder to justify the longer you sail. When the 2nd Pacific Squadron left the Baltic, Port Arthur was still under Russian control. The fleet had a purpose that, however difficult, was at least coherent: reach the Far East, reinforce the Pacific Squadron, contest Japanese naval supremacy. As the months passed, and the fleet moved steadily through its sequence of anchorages and coaling operations, the news that filtered through from the war zone told a progressively darker story. The armies were not performing as Russia had hoped. Port Arthur was under severe pressure. The narrative of the voyage, which had begun as a rescue mission of sorts, was quietly transforming into something more ambiguous, and the men of the fleet felt this even when it was not discussed openly. The psychological cost of that transformation is not easy to quantify, but it was real. Sailing into genuine danger is one thing when you believe the effort has a clear purpose and a reasonable chance of meaningful impact. It becomes something different when the purpose has started to blur and the chance of impact has started to look less reasonable. The men of the 2nd Pacific Squadron did not turn back, and many of them behaved with genuine courage when the moment came. But they were not the same force that a different set of circumstances, better training, better rest, a shorter voyage, clearer strategic purpose might have delivered to the waters near Japan. What the voyage had produced across its many thousands of miles was a fleet that existed in 2 versions simultaneously: the version on paper, with its impressive tonnage and firepower, and the version in reality, whose guns had not been fired enough, whose crews were tired, and whose collective sense of what they were sailing toward had grown steadily more uncertain with every passing week. The battle had not yet been fought, but in certain important ways its outcome was already being shaped by everything that had happened before a single shot was fired. While Rozhestvensky's squadron ground its way south and east, through those weary months, the war it had been sent to influence did not wait. Wars rarely do. The conflict in Manchuria and the waters around it had its own momentum, its own logic, and by the time the Baltic Fleet was measuring its progress in coal consumed and miles covered, the strategic situation it had departed to address was already a different thing from the one that had existed when the orders were written. On land, the picture had been deteriorating in a way that Russian military planners had consistently failed to anticipate. Japanese forces had proved themselves not merely competent, but operationally sophisticated, in ways that confounded the assumptions embedded in Russian planning. The Meiji military, shaped by decades of deliberate modernization, and advised by officers who had studied European warfare seriously and selectively, fought with a coherence and aggression that repeatedly disrupted Russian expectations. Russian forces in Manchuria were not without courage or numbers, but they were hampered by an extraordinarily long and fragile supply line running back through Siberia on a railway that was not yet complete, by command relationships that generated friction where coordination was needed, and by a tendency to respond to Japanese initiative rather than seizing their own. The Battle of Liaoyang in August of 1904, one of the largest engagements of the war up to that point, ended without the decisive Russian victory that might have stabilized the situation. Russian forces withdrew when the tactical balance did not demand it, a decision that reflected something deeper than immediate battlefield logic, a hesitation, a failure of nerve at the critical level that would prove characteristic. Further setbacks followed. The land campaign was not producing the kind of results that might have justified optimism about how the war would resolve itself before the Baltic Fleet arrived. But the development that truly transformed the fleet's situation, the one that reshaped its purpose in the most fundamental way, was happening at Port Arthur itself. The fortress and its harbour, which the fleet had been dispatched to relieve and reinforce, were under siege. Japanese land forces had invested the port from the surrounding hills, and what had initially seemed like a position capable of extended defence was proving more vulnerable than expected, partly because the hills that dominated the harbour were not held with the tenacity they required. As Japanese siege artillery was dragged to commanding positions, it gained the ability to fire down into the harbour itself, into the anchorage where the remnant of the 1st Pacific Squadron sat. The Russian warships trapped in Port Arthur had continued to sortie on occasion, attempting to contest the naval situation or break out toward Vladivostok. The Battle of the Yellow Sea in August 1904 represented the most serious of these attempts, a genuine effort to fight through to Vladivostok, where the squadron might have posed an ongoing threat to Japanese supply lines and potentially linked up eventually with whatever the Baltic Fleet became. The attempt failed. Ships were damaged, scattered, or forced to return to port, and afterward the 1st Pacific Squadron's effectiveness as a fighting force was essentially over. The ships sat in harbour, increasingly reduced to floating batteries, their fate tied to the land battle raging above them. Port Arthur fell on the 2nd day of January 1905. The news reached the fleet somewhere in the waters it was passing through on its seemingly endless journey, and the effect of that news on Rozhestvensky, on his officers, on everyone who understood its implications, was something that the official record tends to treat with the careful restraint that military correspondence typically applies to disasters. But the implications were not ambiguous. The 1st Pacific Squadron, what remained of it, was gone. The ships had been sunk at their moorings by artillery fire from the hills above, scuttled or wrecked to prevent their capture. The port itself was surrendered. This created a situation of considerable strategic peculiarity. The Baltic Fleet had been organised and dispatched, at enormous cost and effort, as a reinforcing and relieving force. It was sailing to join a squadron that no longer existed, toward a port that was now in enemy hands. The original operational purpose, to restore Russian naval strength in the Pacific, to contest Japanese sea control, to sustain Port Arthur and the forces depending on it, had been overtaken by events in the most complete possible way. The fleet was still sailing, but it was no longer sailing toward the situation it had been built to address. What this meant in practice was that the 2nd Pacific Squadron's mission had transformed from something concrete into something considerably more abstract and considerably more dangerous. If it could not reinforce a friendly force at a friendly port, it had to fight its way to Vladivostok, the only remaining Russian port of consequence in the region, and somehow establish naval dominance sufficient to affect the war's outcome from there. This required defeating the Japanese fleet outright, in open battle, against an opponent that had spent the intervening months not exhausted by a 7-month voyage, but resting, repairing, and preparing specifically for this encounter. The asymmetry was not lost on anyone who thought about it clearly. There is a particular kind of institutional difficulty in acknowledging, within a military hierarchy, that the original rationale for a major operation has dissolved. The fleet had been committed. The Tsar had publicly identified it as the instrument of Russia's revival in the Far East. The political and symbolic weight of the enterprise made simply turning around, which was not a realistic option in any case, unthinkable. So the fleet continued, but it continued now toward a redefined objective that was both more demanding and less achievable than the original one. The purpose had been retrofitted to fit the new reality, but the fleet itself had not been redesigned to fit the new purpose. The gap between what the mission had been and what it now was, between the circumstances under which the fleet had been assembled and the circumstances it was actually about to encounter, was not something that could be addressed by orders or exhortation. It was structural. The men sailing those ships were not the same as they had been 7 months earlier. The strategic situation was not what it had been when they left, and the enemy waiting for them had every advantage that comes from fighting close to home, fully prepared against an opponent that had already, in important ways, been defeated before the battle began. Into this already compromised situation came additional ships, reinforcements in the technical sense of the word, though what they actually reinforced is worth examining carefully. While the main squadron had been grinding its way around Africa, Russian naval authorities had been assembling a supplementary force under Rear Admiral Nebogatov, a collection of vessels that, even by the standards of a fleet that had not been inspiring on paper, represented something closer to a naval museum than a fighting squadron. The ships Nebogatov brought included older coastal defence battleships, vessels designed for operations close to home waters, not for blue water combat against modern Japanese warships, along with other ageing units whose presence in any serious battle line was more a function of institutional desperation than strategic calculation. There is something almost painful in the logic that produced this reinforcement. Russian naval authorities understood, at some level, that Rozhestvensky's squadron was not strong enough to guarantee the outcome it needed to achieve. The solution they reached for was to add ships. More hulls, more guns, more flags flying. The arithmetic of naval strength, at its most superficial, would show a larger fleet departing than the one that had set out. What the arithmetic obscured was that these additional ships brought with them problems that multiplication of numbers could not solve, and in some respects actively made worse. Slower ships constrain a fleet to their speed. This is not a technicality. It is a tactical and strategic reality with serious consequences. Nebogatov's older vessels could not match even the modest pace that Rozhestvensky's ships had maintained. Incorporating them into a unified squadron meant accepting a reduced fleet speed at precisely the moment when the ability to manoeuvre, to choose engagement on favourable terms, or to simply outrun portions of the problem carried enormous potential value. A faster squadron might preserve more options. A slower one had fewer. Adding Nebogatov's ships converted a modest advantage in flexibility into a significant disadvantage, while adding firepower that was, against modern Japanese warships firing at serious ranges, of questionable worth. The debates that surrounded this reinforcement, and there were debates, conducted through the compressed medium of telegraph dispatches between Rozhestvensky's position at sea and the naval authorities in St. Petersburg, extended beyond the question of Nebogatov's ships to encompass the entire posture of the expedition going forward. Should the fleet press on immediately? Should it wait in Madagascar, where it had paused, for Nebogatov to arrive? Was there a route that offered meaningful advantages over others? Was the enterprise still viable at all? Rozhestvensky's own position in these debates was complex and in some ways contradictory. He did not believe, by most accounts, that waiting for Nebogatov would improve his prospects in any meaningful way. He understood what those additional ships were, but he was also operating within a command structure that had decided to send them, and within a political environment in which the Tsar's expectations and the symbolic weight of the fleet's mission foreclosed any honest accounting of the odds. Expressing doubt was possible, acting on that doubt in any definitive way was not. So the fleet waited in the waters off Madagascar for weeks, while Nebogatov made his way south, losing time that it could not recover in a war that was not pausing to accommodate Russian deliberation. The question of route carried its own set of uncomfortable trade-offs. The most direct path to Vladivostok lay through the Korea Strait, the passage between Korea and Japan, which was narrow, well known to the Japanese, and almost certain to be patrolled heavily. Alternate routes existed through the Tsugaru Strait between the Japanese home islands, or around the north of Japan through La Perouse Strait. These longer passages offered the theoretical advantage of surprise, but surprise had to be weighed against the additional distance, additional coal consumption, additional strain on machinery and men already worn by months at sea, and the genuine uncertainty about whether the fleet's condition permitted any extended additional sailing. Every route had something wrong with it. The Korea Strait offered the shortest path and the most dangerous encounter. The alternatives offered longer paths and complications of their own, without any certainty that the Japanese would be any less ready when contact finally came. Underlying all of these specific debates was the larger question that nobody in the chain of command could quite bring themselves to answer directly, whether continuing made sense at all. The original mission had dissolved with Port Arthur. The revised mission, fight through to Vladivostok, defeat the Japanese fleet, somehow affect the war's outcome from there, rested on defeating an opponent that had every structural advantage. The fleet was tired. Its crews had been at sea for most of a year. Its machinery had been pushed hard and repaired under conditions that were not ideal. Its morale, which had never been high and had suffered through the Dogger Bank incident, and the news from Port Arthur and the long grinding monotony of the voyage, was not what it needed to be for a fleet asked to do something extraordinarily difficult against a fully prepared enemy. Turning back would have required acknowledging failure before the battle was fought. Politically impossible in the Russia of Nicholas II, symbolically devastating for an empire already under strain, and structurally unthinkable for a military hierarchy that had committed itself to the enterprise. So the option that some officers may have considered privately, that a cold-eyed strategic analysis might have recommended, was never seriously on the table. The fleet would go forward because the fleet could not go back, not because forward offered any realistic promise of success. This is the condition in which Rozhestvensky and his officers found themselves as the combined squadron, 2nd Pacific Squadron joined now by Nebagotov's 3rd Division, finally got underway again, carrying with them all the accumulated weight of the voyage, the changed strategic situation, the debatable reinforcements, and the knowledge that the options available to them had narrowed to the point where choosing among them felt less like strategy and more like selecting which form of difficulty to accept. The Japanese fleet, by contrast, was waiting. It had been waiting with growing certainty about where the Russians would have to go, preparing with the particular focus of a force that understood the engagement ahead, represented an opportunity, not a problem. The asymmetry between those two states of readiness was, in a sense, the battle that had already been decided before either fleet came in sight of the other. While Rozhestvensky's fleet ground through its deliberations and Nebagotov's aging ships closed the distance from behind, the man waiting at the other end of that journey was spending his time rather differently. Admiral Heihachiro Togo had not crossed any oceans. He had not struggled with cold depots or hostile neutrals or the slow erosion of machinery pushed beyond its design limits. He had remained in Japanese home waters, working his fleet, drilling his crews, and thinking carefully about exactly how he intended to destroy the Russians when they finally arrived. Togo is a figure who rewards attention. He had been trained partly in Britain, had studied naval warfare with the kind of methodical seriousness that the Meiji-era Japanese military brought to nearly everything it set its mind to, and had already demonstrated his capabilities in the opening moves of the war, including the surprise attack on Port Arthur and a series of engagements in the Yellow Sea, where his handling of the combined fleet had been confident and tactically assured. He was not a man who confused activity with preparation or noise with readiness. When the reports began coming in about the Russian squadron's progress, and the Japanese intelligence picture of the Russian movements was, by most accounts, substantially better than the Russians might have hoped, Togo processed the information and continued his preparations without apparent anxiety. This composure rested on something real. Japan's position as the Russian fleet approached was structurally advantageous in ways that went far beyond the personality of a single admiral. The combined fleet was operating in waters its officers had known their entire careers. The Korea Strait, the likely passage point, was Japanese geography in the most practical sense. Every current, every shoal, every weather pattern was familiar in a way that no chart study could replicate for an officer who had spent the past several months watching the coast of Madagascar or the waters of the Indian Ocean. Togo's ships could sortie from their bases, engage, and return. If a vessel required urgent repair, that repair happened in a Japanese yard, with Japanese workers and Japanese materials, not under a tropical sun on an improvised anchorage. The logistical freedom that Japan enjoyed and Russia conspicuously lacked was not a minor operational footnote. It shaped everything about the campaign's character. Intelligence compounded this advantage in ways that gave Japanese planning a specificity the Russians could not match in reverse. Japanese agents and observation posts had tracked the Russian fleet's progress with considerable consistency. The question for Togo was not whether the Russians were coming, but when and by which route, a narrower uncertainty, and one that Japanese reconnaissance and signals intelligence were well positioned to resolve as the fleet approached. The contrast with the Russian side is instructive. Rozhestvensky's officers debated routes partly because they had limited reliable information about Japanese dispositions and intentions. Togo, by the time the fleets were close to contact, had a reasonably clear picture of what was moving toward him. None of this advantage would have mattered without a fleet capable of exploiting it, and this is where Japanese preparation in the months before Tsushima becomes genuinely significant. Togo had used the waiting period to train. This may sound unremarkable, all fleets train, but the training the combined fleet conducted was specifically oriented toward the kind of engagement Togo expected to fight. Concentrated gunnery at medium ranges, coordinated maneuver among divisions, the ability to maintain formation and cohesion under fire. Japanese gun crews drilled repeatedly. Fire control procedures were refined. The doctrine that Togo intended to apply was not improvised in the face of the approaching enemy. It had been rehearsed, adjusted, and rehearsed again. The gunnery comparison between the two fleets deserves careful attention because it cuts to the heart of why the battle unfolded as it did. Japanese accuracy at combat ranges reflected sustained practice under conditions designed to simulate the stress and pace of actual engagement. The Russians, by contrast, had fired their guns only sparingly during the voyage. Concerns about ammunition supply and the mechanical strain of full gunnery exercises on ships already working hard had limited practice opportunities. More fundamentally, months at sea with the accumulated stresses of the journey had not created the conditions for the kind of focused, repeated training that sharpens a gun crew into something genuinely dangerous at range. The gap between the two forces in gunnery effectiveness was not simply a question of equipment. The Russians had guns capable of serious work, but of the human and procedural systems that determined how effectively those guns would be used when it mattered. Japanese shell design contributed another dimension to this asymmetry. Japanese ammunition for the battle included a high proportion of shells filled with Shimo's powder, a highly sensitive explosive compound that produced dramatically different effects on impact compared to the armor-piercing rounds that both sides relied on for penetrating hardened steel. Against unarmored or lightly protected sections of a ship, superstructure, gun positions, communications equipment, the men working those positions, Shimo's shells created fires, shrapnel, and shock effects that compounded rapidly. The cumulative impact of multiple hits of this character on a ship's crew, equipment, and command function could be devastating independent of whether the hits were penetrating vital machinery or magazines. What Togo had assembled in the end was not a perfect fleet in an absolute sense. The Japanese Navy had its own limitations and had taken losses during the war, but the combined fleet that waited for the Russians was a coherent fighting force. Well coordinated, accurately gunned, familiar with its operating environment, led by experienced officers with established habits of working together, and clear about its tactical intentions. It did not need to be the best fleet in the world in some abstract measurement. It needed to be substantially better than the specific fleet approaching it, in the specific circumstances of the encounter ahead. This is precisely why Japan never needed to match Russia's extraordinary effort of sailing halfway around the world. The strategic logic ran entirely in the other direction. Russia had to come to Japan. Japan had only to be ready when Russia arrived. Every advantage that derives from home waters, from rested crews, from concentrated training time, from short supply lines, from superior intelligence, all of it accrued to the waiting side, not the travelling one. The exhausting, complicated 7-month odyssey that the 2nd Pacific Squadron had completed was in some respects the precise measure of the disadvantage Russia was sailing into. Togo had spent that same time becoming more ready. The Russians had spent it becoming less so. By mid-May 1905, the arithmetic of the campaign had reduced itself to a single question of geography. The Russian fleet was in the South China Sea, its destination no longer in any real doubt, and the Korean Strait, the narrow body of water separating the Korean peninsula from the Japanese island of Kyushu, had become the fulcrum on which everything would turn. There were, technically, other ways to reach Vladivostok. The fleet could swing wide to the east, passing through the Tsugaru Strait between Honshu and Hokkaido, or even further still through the La Pérouse Strait to the north. Either route would add days to a journey already measured in months, require additional coal that was not easily available, and pass through waters that offered no particular protection from interception. More importantly, the ships themselves had become the argument against ambitious routing. After 7 months at sea, the hulls of the slower vessels were fouled with marine growth that dragged their speed downward. Machinery that had been worked continuously was operating on narrowing tolerances. The men who tended that machinery were tired in a way that sleep could no longer fully address. The 2nd Pacific Squadron had become, through the accumulated punishment of its voyage, a fleet that needed the shortest path to its destination, rather than the most cautious one. The Tsushima Strait, the western channel of the Korea Strait, passing directly between the Korean coast and the island of Tsushima, was the most direct approach. It cut the remaining distance as cleanly as a straight line on a chart could manage. Rozhestvensky understood, with the clarity that comes from having no good options, that the eastern routes were likely beyond the practical reach of his slower ships and would not meaningfully reduce the risk of interception, only extend the time during which that interception might occur. The strait was the route. The question was less one of decision than of acknowledgement. The choice had a brutal logic that the Russian admiral could recognize without taking any comfort from it. Togo knew the strait well. Japanese observation posts commanded the approaches to it. The waters around Tsushima had been Japanese operational territory for the entirety of the war. Choosing the direct route meant accepting that the engagement, when it came, would happen on ground entirely of the enemy's choosing. Not choosing it meant accepting a different set of punishments: more coal burned, more miles steamed, more time for machinery to fail, without the compensating benefit of avoiding contact. The strait was a trap, and the alternative routes were slower traps. Rozhestvensky chose the faster one. The fleet entered the East China Sea and moved northeast. The weather was foggy in the days before the crossing, which offered some concealment but also complicated station-keeping for a squadron that had always struggled to maintain tight formation. Ships that had crossed 3 oceans together still did not move with the disciplined cohesion that a fleet needs in combat. Intervals opened and closed unpredictably. The column was never quite as clean as the charts made it look on paper. Officers watching the surrounding ships from their bridges understood that whatever engagement came next would involve a formation less orderly than doctrine required. On the night of May 26th, the fleet pressed into the strait under low clouds. Rozhestvensky had ordered lights reduced, radio silence where possible, and speed held at a rate the slowest ships could sustain. The hospital ships sailing with the fleet, lit according to international convention, were later suspected of having given away the fleet's position, though the exact sequence of Japanese intelligence on that final night has been interpreted in different ways. What is clear is that Japanese picket vessels made contact with elements of the Russian fleet during the night hours, and that the information reached Togo while there was still time to act on it. Aboard the Russian ships, the expectation of battle had been building for days, in a way that is difficult to fully separate from exhaustion. These were men who had been at sea since October, who had weathered the Dogger Bank crisis and the equatorial heat, and the months of waiting at Madagascar, and the endless grinding passage through waters far from anything familiar. Some had probably ceased to believe the voyage would end in anything other than anticlimax. that perhaps they would slip through and reach Vladivostok without a decisive engagement, that the war would resolve itself through diplomacy before the guns spoke. Others seemed to have expected battle with a fatalism that had replaced whatever earlier enthusiasm the departure from Libau had generated. Rozhestvensky himself, by most accounts, had long since stopped indulging in scenarios where the operation ended well. His job, as he apparently understood it, was to fight what was coming and accept the result. The morning of May 27th brought clearing visibility over the strait. Poor conditions for the Russians, who might have benefited from fog, and reasonably workable conditions for an enemy who knew exactly where to look. The water through which the fleet moved was not wide. Tsushima itself sat to the east, the Korean coast to the west, and the channel between them concentrated the possibilities into something that could not be navigated around. Every mile steamed was a mile that reduced the remaining uncertainty about where and when contact would come. There is something almost narrative in how completely the strait concentrated the action. The months of voyage, the accidents, the incidents, the port calls, and political crises and mechanical failures had all been funneling toward this piece of water. The Japanese combined fleet was to the northeast, already underway, moving to intercept a position it had calculated with a confidence born of superior intelligence and home waters familiarity. The Russians were sailing toward it because there was nowhere else to sail. By mid-morning, the lookouts on both sides were working the same horizon. The encounter that Russia's strategic problem, Japan's preparation, 7 months of extraordinary effort, and a chain of decisions stretching back through the war had made inevitable, was now a matter of hours. The road to Tsushima had been 7 months long, and covered something like 18,000 miles. The final miles of it were passing beneath the keels of ships whose crews had grown old at sea, heading into water where a well-rested, well-prepared, thoroughly drilled fleet was already moving to meet them. Contact came in the late morning. Japanese cruisers had been shadowing the fleet for hours, broadcasting position reports that Togo received aboard his flagship, the Mikasa, with enough time to arrange his forces deliberately. He did not rush. The combined fleet sortied from its anchorage at Masan on the Korean coast, and moved to intercept at a point of Togo's choosing, not Rozhestvensky's. That distinction mattered enormously. The Russian admiral was reacting to geography. The Japanese admiral was reacting to information. Togo's battle plan turned on a core idea. He needed to bring his faster, better coordinated ships into a gunnery position that maximised their advantages and exposed Russian weaknesses. His fleet could make around 15 knots reliably. The Russian main body, constrained by its slowest battleships and supply vessels, was managing perhaps 9. That differential was not merely a number, it was the operational foundation on which Togo built everything else. Speed meant he could choose the angle of engagement, that he could dictate range, that he could refuse positions he disliked and impose positions he preferred. The fleets sighted each other properly around midday. What followed in the next half hour has been analysed and debated by naval historians ever since, because Togo made a decision that appeared, in the moment, extraordinarily dangerous. The Russian fleet was advancing in a roughly northward column. Togo, approaching from the northeast, executed a turn that swung his entire line across the front of the Russian ships, a manoeuvre that briefly pointed his fleet perpendicular to the enemy's guns and presented each of his ships, one after another, as they passed through the turn, as a relatively stationary target. In formal terms, this was crossing the Russian T, placing the broadside batteries of his entire fleet against an enemy who could only reply with his forward guns. But completing the manoeuvre required passing through a genuinely dangerous interval. Rozhestvensky recognized what was happening and ordered his ships to open fire. The Russian gunnery in those opening minutes was not negligible. The Mikasa was hit multiple times and sustained casualties. But it was not accurate enough, not sustained enough, not coordinated enough to disrupt what Togo was attempting. The turn completed. The Japanese line stabilized into a parallel course that crossed ahead of the Russians, raking the leading ships with concentrated fire. The Suvorov, Rozhestvensky's flagship, was struck repeatedly and quickly reduced to a burning, barely steerable wreck. Within the first hour, the fleet's command structure had effectively collapsed. Rozhestvensky was seriously wounded. The Suvorov fell out of line. Signals that might have coordinated a Russian response were going unanswered, because the flagship from which they should have originated was fighting for its own survival. The gunnery disparity revealed itself quickly and brutally. The Japanese crews were trained to a standard the Russians had never approached. Their fire was faster, better ranged, and more effectively concentrated on priority targets. The Russian ships, by contrast, were firing with crews that had spent 7 months at sea and had conducted nothing resembling realistic gunnery practice in conditions that actually simulated battle. Some Russian shells failed to detonate, some Russian range-finding was simply wrong. The Japanese shells, meanwhile, contained a high explosive filler, what Western observers sometimes called Shimose powder, that created devastating fires and fragmentation effects on impact, and the Russian ships, with their accumulated paint, wood fittings, and stored materials, proved highly susceptible to exactly this kind of damage. Speed compounded every other problem. Togo's fleet could maneuver to maintain the engagement at a range favourable to Japanese gunnery, while denying the Russians the ability to close to ranges where their own guns might be more effective. When damaged Russian ships slowed, the gap widened further. The fleet that had struggled to maintain formation across 3 oceans struggled far more desperately now, under fire, with captains dead or incapacitated, and communication between ships degraded by smoke, damage, and the fundamental chaos that descends on any formation when the leading elements are being systematically destroyed. The battleship Osliabia sank early in the fighting. The first Russian capital ship lost, the first such loss, some accounts note, of a pre-dreadnought battleship to gunfire in naval history. The Suvorov burned and fought on for hours before torpedo boats finished her in the evening. The Alexander III capsized. The Borodino exploded. These were the newest and most powerful ships in the Russian squadron, the core of whatever fighting capacity the Voyage had been intended to deliver. They were gone before the afternoon light began to fail. Rozhestvensky, badly wounded, was transferred from the wreck of the Suvorov to a destroyer, eventually falling into Japanese hands. Command passed through a succession of officers who lacked both the authority and the situational awareness to impose any coherent order on what remained of the fleet. Ships that survived the afternoon attempted to continue north toward Vladivostok because that was the stated mission and there was no alternative instruction. Japanese cruisers and torpedo boats pursued through the night, attacking with torpedoes, sinking more ships in the darkness. The chaos of the daylight battle became the chaos of a night pursuit, and the Russians had no answer for either. By the morning of May 28th, what remained of the 2nd Pacific Squadron had ceased to exist as a fighting force in any meaningful sense. Rear Admiral Nebagatov, commanding the surviving vessels, a collection of older battleships and coast defence ships that had joined the fleet as the reinforcement Rozhestvensky had never wanted, made the decision to surrender. He ran up the signal for capitulation and struck his colours with several ships still around him, calculating, with a cold practical logic, that men should not be killed to prolong a battle, whose outcome was no longer in question. It was a decision that earned him a court-martial and a death sentence in Russia, later commuted, and that was understood by the Japanese as a conventional military act. A handful of ships attempted to scatter and reach neutral ports. They were mostly interned. 3 small vessels eventually reached Vladivostok, 3 out of a fleet that had sailed with 38 warships. The numbers that resulted from roughly 2 days of contact tell the story in the starkest possible form. Russia lost 8 battleships, numerous cruisers and auxiliaries, approximately 5,000 men killed, and more than 6,000 taken prisoner. Japan lost 3 torpedo boats. In terms of the ratio between forces engaged and losses sustained, Tsushima stands among the most decisive naval engagements ever recorded, a battle in which the outcome was not merely one-sided, but nearly total. The fleet that had taken 7 months to arrive had been functionally eliminated in a single afternoon, with the remnants mopped up through the following night and morning. The road to Tsushima had been 18,000 miles long. The battle itself was over before the second sunrise. The numbers from Tsushima are so extreme that they invite a particular kind of historical question, not simply who won and who lost, but why the margin was so vast. Lopsided defeats happen in warfare, but defeats of this totality, where a major fleet is functionally erased while the opposing force loses almost nothing, require explanation at multiple levels. The causes at Tsushima were not singular. They layered on top of one another across years, months, and finally hours, and distinguishing between what was structurally inevitable and what might conceivably have gone differently is worth doing carefully. Start with the long-term structural problems, because they are in many ways the most damning. The Russian Imperial Navy in 1904 was an institution shaped by imperial prestige rather than operational effectiveness. Ships were built to satisfy political ambitions and bureaucratic processes, not coherent strategic requirements. The result was a fleet that looked impressive on paper. The tonnage was real, the guns were real, but that had never developed the institutional culture of continuous training, tactical experimentation, and honest self-assessment that characterized the Japanese Navy of the same era. Japan had spent the decades since the Meiji Restoration deliberately studying naval warfare, absorbing British expertise, running exercises that were designed to expose weaknesses rather than conceal them. Russia had spent the same period constructing a navy that could be pointed at on a map. The gap this created in crew proficiency, gunnery accuracy, and tactical flexibility was not something that could be closed in 7 months at sea. It had been accumulating for a generation. The technology gap was real but somewhat more nuanced. The Russian ships were not dramatically inferior in terms of individual armament. Their guns could, in principle, fire shells that would devastate Japanese warships. The problem was that in practice they rarely hit, and when they did, a meaningful proportion of their shells failed to function properly. A problem traced to manufacturing deficiencies and inadequate quality control that went unaddressed because the naval bureaucracy was not organized to detect and fix such failures. The Japanese shells, by contrast, used a high explosive compound that produced fires and fragmentation damage particularly destructive to the conditions Russian ships were in: worn, cluttered with months of accumulated materials, and crewed by men who had never drilled seriously for damage control under fire. This was not simply a question of one side having better technology. It was a question of one side having an institutional system capable of identifying what worked, procuring it reliably, and training crews to employ it effectively. Logistics compounded every other weakness. The voyage itself, whatever one thinks about its strategic wisdom, was genuinely extraordinary as a feat of organization. But it was extraordinary precisely because it required improvising solutions to problems that a well-prepared navy would have anticipated years in advance. The lack of Allied ports, the dependence on German colliers, the coaling at sea under tropical conditions, these were not incidental difficulties. They consumed energy, degraded equipment, exhausted crews, and consumed the months that might theoretically have been used for training. Ships that arrived at Tsushima were in materially worse condition than when they had left the Baltic, and their crews were in worse psychological condition as well. The Russians did not arrive fresh. They arrived depleted, and the Japanese knew it. Leadership sits in a more complicated position in any analysis of Tsushima, because Rozhestvensky was not a simple incompetent. He had navigated an almost impossible logistical challenge across 3 oceans. His reading of his own situation was, in most respects, clear-eyed. He knew the fleet was unlikely to win. He communicated this to St. Petersburg, and he was ignored. But his choices during the final approach showed a rigidity and a failure of tactical imagination that contributed to the disaster. The decision to attempt the Tsushima Strait in column rather than exploring other approaches, The failure to disperse his auxiliary vessels or develop a coherent battle plan that accounted for Japanese speed superiority, the collapse of command communication when the Suvorov was disabled, these were errors of execution layered on top of structural disadvantages. A more tactically creative commander might not have won, but a more tactically creative commander might have made the defeat more costly for Japan, might have preserved more ships, might have changed the political calculus of what followed, which raises the most counterfactual and contested question. Was the fleet doomed before it ever arrived? There is a reasonable argument that yes, given everything, the training deficit, the material condition of the ships, the Japanese preparation, the speed differential, no battle plan available to Rozhestvensky would have produced a different strategic outcome. Togo had too many structural advantages, and the gap between the two fleets in practical fighting capacity was too wide. On this view, Tsushima was not a battle decided in the Tsushima Strait. It was decided in the dockyards, the training grounds, and the administrative offices of St. Petersburg and Tokyo over the preceding decade. But there is also a more contingent argument worth considering. The Russian fleet, even as it was not negligible in raw firepower. A different tactical approach, perhaps attempting the passage at night, perhaps accepting greater dispersion to complicate Japanese targeting, perhaps concentrating fire more coherently in the opening minutes when Togo's turn left his column briefly exposed, might have altered the exchange of losses significantly. Not a Russian victory, perhaps, but a defeat that cost Japan enough ships and enough men to shift negotiations and domestic politics in ways that mattered. The margin between an overwhelming defeat and a less complete one sometimes hinges on factors that were genuinely contingent rather than predetermined. What made Tsushima one of the most decisive naval battles in history was precisely the convergence of all these levels simultaneously. The structural weaknesses meant the fleet arrived disadvantaged. The logistical ordeal meant it arrived in degraded condition. The leadership failures meant it fought without coordination or adaptability. The tactical situation meant the Japanese could exploit every one of these vulnerabilities with precision. Each cause amplified the others, and the result was not just a defeat but an annihilation, a battle in which one side exercised something close to complete control over the engagement from the moment the fleets sighted each other to the moment the last colours were struck. Tsushima did not merely end the war at sea. It demonstrated with a clarity that naval strategists across the world immediately recognized what it meant for one navy to have transformed itself into a modern fighting institution, while another remained, beneath the steel and the guns, an artifact of older assumptions about what a navy was for. The transformation of the 2nd Pacific Squadron from a symbol of imperial resolve into a byword for catastrophic miscalculation happened within a matter of hours, but understanding why requires stepping back from the Tsushima Strait and looking at what this entire episode meant in the larger sweep of history. For Russia, Tsushima was more than a military defeat. It was a public humiliation on a global scale, broadcast to every chancellery, naval ministry, and newspaper in the world almost immediately. The Tsar had staked enormous political capital on the idea that Russian power, properly mobilized, could overwhelm what many in St. Petersburg had privately dismissed as an upstart Asian nation. When the fleet that had sailed with such ceremony, such sacrifice, and such hope was effectively erased in a single afternoon, the political consequences were immediate and severe. The defeat at Tsushima effectively ended Russian ambitions in the Pacific. For a generation, forced the negotiated settlement at Portsmouth that summer, and confirmed Japan's emergence as a major power in terms no one could any longer dismiss or qualify. At home, Tsushima did not cause the 1905 revolution. That process had already begun with the killings of Bloody Sunday in January, the spreading strikes and mutinies, the grinding losses in Manchuria. But it intensified the crisis and stripped away one of the last arguments available to those who believed the autocracy could recover its prestige through military success. The war that was supposed to demonstrate Russian strength had instead exposed before the entire world the gap between imperial self-image and institutional reality. Tsushima became a symbol within Russia as much as outside it, proof for those who were already convinced that the system as it existed could not be reformed from within and could not compete with modern industrial powers that had organized themselves differently. The international reverberations were no less significant. Naval strategists from Britain, Germany, France, the United States, and Japan itself studied Tsushima intensely in the years that followed. What they saw confirmed several evolving theories about modern naval warfare and forced reconsideration of others. The battle demonstrated with unusual clarity that the decisive factor in fleet combat was not merely the quantity of guns, but the accuracy with which they could be directed at speed against manoeuvring targets over significant ranges. Gunnery and fire control, the technical and organizational capacity to put shells on target consistently, had emerged as the central variable. This conclusion contributed directly to the naval arms races and design revolutions that followed, including the development of the all-big-gun battleship that would define the next decade of naval competition. Tsushima did not cause the dreadnought era, but it provided powerful evidence for the arguments of those pushing in that direction. What Tsushima also revealed in ways that were harder to quantify but no less important was what it meant for an institution to be genuinely prepared versus superficially equipped. The Japanese Navy had spent years building not just ships, but the human and organizational infrastructure to use them. Crew training, tactical development, damage control, fire discipline, signal communication, all of it had been developed through a sustained commitment to institutional learning that the Russian Navy had simply not matched. Industrial power mattered enormously, but industrial power alone could not produce that kind of fighting capacity. It had to be cultivated over time, through a culture that valued honest evaluation of performance over the preservation of bureaucratic comfort. The lesson was available to anyone who looked carefully. A fleet built to project prestige was not the same as a fleet built to fight. For Rozhestvensky personally, the end of the battle brought capture and, eventually, a return to Russia, where he lived out his remaining years in relative obscurity. He had asked, more than once, to be relieved of the command he had been given. He had warned that the mission was likely to fail. He had sailed anyway, because that was what was asked of him, and the fleet had gone with him, because that was what empires do with the instruments they have built. They deploy them, even when the deployment makes little rational sense, because the alternative is an admission of weakness that feels politically impossible. And that, perhaps, is the most honest answer to the question this story has been circling since the beginning. Why did the Russian Navy sail halfway around the world only to lose in a single day? Not because of any single decision, any single commander, any single flaw in a ship or a shell or a battle plan. The fleet sailed because empires in crisis reach for the tools they have, regardless of whether those tools are suited to the problem. It sailed because prestige and institutional momentum are powerful forces that can override strategic calculation. It sailed because stopping would have required admitting before the voyage ever began that the entire framework of assumptions underpinning Russian imperial power in the Far East was built on something closer to illusion than to strength. Tsushima did not create that truth. It simply made it impossible to look away from.